The first part of this process is practicing restraint. And that's just the idea of limiting the amount of sounds that you actually use to make your beat so that you can use mixing to do more with the composite production. That'll make sense the further we get down the line. But if we start with like 50 tracks, it's a lot to deal with. It also, if you're trying to send out beats for artists or just make things that are easier to listen to, less is always more, and it's more about how you use the elements that are present. So in this demonstration, I'm going to be doing that by trying to limit myself to 10 sounds. So I'm going to pick 3 instruments and then drag in 10 drum sounds, and then we can move on to making the melody, making the beat, and then mixing it. So I'll use this decent sampler, and I think we'll grab a piano from here. Cool. We can go to expand, and maybe we can grab this bell. That's cool. And then let's open repro and find like a synth lead. Cool, I like that. And then let's grab some sounds, some drum samples. 5 more drums, let's see. One more. Let's see. Oh, gotta get a kick. So we've got our 3 instruments and our 7 drums. Let's get into making the beat. But before we get started, something I like to do is always mix into my soft clipper, because when you don't, you'll just have to mix again once you put it on after you've done all your leveling, and that's really frustrating. A lot of the best engineers that I've observed, like Mike Dean and Jason Joshua, tend to have that same workflow. And this is just an all stock preset that comes with the Centerfold drum kit. But I also have a blog post on my site that demonstrates how to build the entire thing from scratch, so I'll link that below as well. And then just a quick demonstration of the difference that the clipping will make, and then the whole reason that I put it on there in the first place. Off, on. Again, just much easier to mix into all of those effects. Check out the blog post down below. It'll do a much better job of explaining it. I also have a really good masterclass on brick wall limiting that'll be linked below as well. Definitely check that out. And then we can layer that piano with some bells. We can just copy the MIDI for that. All right, I'm back. They were cutting grass or some shit outside. It was mad distracting. So I took a break, got a hoodie, and now I'm back onto the drums. are back to cutting grass. Hopefully it's not too bad for you guys in the audio. I'm sure I'll be able to clean it up. Forgive me. But now we're going to get into the first level of gain staging, which is just leveling things out in my channel rack. So I'll talk through the larger concept of relativity that I use when I'm leveling things in general. And I think that'll make more sense than answering the time-aged question of like, what levels do I need to start at? Because if you know even a little bit about mixing, you know that there's no hard answer to that. You'll get a bunch of different answers from a bunch of different people, but the most talented people tend to have like more concepts based around relativity. They have like some starting points that they like to use in terms of decibels, and I'll mention some of my own. But the main thing is to understand is that every mix is going to be different, and that it's more about how things sound in relative nature to each other rather than like getting things to hit at like a certain decibel range. So let's just talk through that right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is mute everything. I like to start with my low end, and it's the 808. So we'll start with this 808. And when I'm leveling this, I'm listening, but I'm also looking at the meter. So for this 808, it's a little too close to the meter because I'm gonna do some signal flow later. So it wouldn't suffer from being just a little bit quieter, but I still want it to be loud. Cool. Then we can bring in the second 808. Want it at about the same point. All right, cool. Then we can start leveling in the kick. Technically, this will be the loudest thing in my mix. So I just want them to add a little bit more to that meter than the 808s do. But again, low end is gonna tend to be the loudest thing in your mix usually. Then we can move on to some of the heavier drum sounds, starting with the snare. So I want this to be more quiet than the low end, but I still want it to be very present. Get that other snare. Can start to bring in everything else, which is really just the hats at this point. And then the melody ends up being the last day. And with these hats, I just want them to be still very present because drum sounds will tend to be the loudest, but I do want them more quiet than most of, if not all of my snares by a reasonable margin. Same with my open hats as well. Now let's bring in a melody. And with the melody, we want things to be present, but it will seem as if you're getting it to sound very loud at a lower amount of volume using faders and knobs and stuff like that, because melodies cover like a large frequency just distribution in general, so they'll be louder in terms of perception. It's a little finicky here, which is why, again, those set levels and those kinds of things don't really matter as much as just understanding the relative concept. It's more about listening, and with practice, you'll get better at it. All right, so now we can get into routing everything into the mixer, and we can get started with the second phase of our gain staging. And just for another kind of reference check, let's listen to it with no soft clipping. With soft clipping. Soft clipping is very important. Definitely check out that blog post if you want to learn how to build this chain on your own. It only takes about 5 minutes. Really good stuff. It's going to be difference making if you've never looked at it before. So now let's go over pretty much the only time that I'll ever use like a set decibel reference. And it's right here in the mix fader when we actually get into leveling things at this point. So just like we did in the channel rack, I'm going to begin in the mix fader by leveling all of the low end stuff. So we'll go ahead and start with this 808. And so in my mixing style, again, it's going to be different from person to person, but I like having my 808s hit right around -6 decibels, usually no louder than that, especially when I have a kick that's going to fill up the rest of that low end. So we'll do the same thing for this 808 here. Now, something very important is that when you get to this point, you're going to want to also take into consideration equalization, because equalization is just leveling by frequency. So it's a very important aspect of gain staging, and it's one that can really add a lot of oomph to your production if you practice it over time. I'm going to do a bit of EQ with this 808 here. Just for this one. I think the other one's fine. So right around 6. Then we can bring in the kick. And so around 3 decibels tends to work really well for me. -3 decibels, that is. And that's just gonna get it sounding nice and loud on top of those 808s. Then again, we move to the heavier drum sounds that aren't low end things. We want this main snare to be very present. Somewhere between -6 and -9 tends to work really well for me. Then the accent snare. Might pan that just a little bit. I also like to EQ all of my drums. Just a 90 hertz cut right here on the console is usually enough. And it just clears up space for those 808s and kicks. Just a little bit more subtle, but difference making over time when you apply it to everything. Same thing on these melodies, just to start, 90 hertz cut, and then we'll get into EQing these a little bit too. Same thing here, just a high pass on the low end, just getting rid of some unwanted stuff. And then I'll do a dynamic EQ here to tame some of that high end. And so the difference between regular EQ and dynamic EQ is that dynamic EQ is just triggered when that frequency range hits like a certain point. So you can see it kind of automating itself. That's the main difference that I've gleaned for anyone who has that question. Could use some more dynamic EQ here, just for when it goes high like that. So before we get into the second part of mixing the melody, I just want to talk signal flow here for a second. So we're just going to take everything that's a melody, and we're going to create a bus by routing all of them to this track only. So now they're not routed to the master anymore. They're all routed to this one track. And the whole point of doing a bus is to apply composite effects. It gives you more control. It saves CPU. It makes sure that like if you want all of the melody to be compressed a certain way, if you want it to be equalized a certain way, if you want it to be affected by certain effects all the same, it's really helpful to just do buses instead. You don't always need them, but I tend to use them in my workflow. So if you want to learn more about how to use signal flow, create buses, do sends, which we're going to be talking about here throughout this section, check out the description below. There's a really dope signal flow guide that I did. And if you guys want an update to that, definitely just let me know down in the comments, because I'm down to do that. So yeah, let me know if that's something that you guys want. And so I'll just open up a melody bus preset that I have, and you can find all of these in the Centerfold drum kit. Right, so instead of having to apply this neutron with all these effects to every single track, which would cost me so much CPU and cause a bunch of other just issues that I can't even get into, it's better to just have one composite bus that affects all of that. You can still have individual effects, which we will get into, but this is just really good for those situations where you want the effect to be composite. And so we'll do the same for our drums. We'll take everything and we'll route it to its own track. And I'll open my drum bus preset. So just through the power of good leveling on a couple of different stages and a little bit of equalization, we've actually gotten this to sound pretty good. But if we want it to sound more full, we have to get into talking about how we can use effects on a more three-dimensional plane, if that makes sense. And that just goes into filling up the spectral space with things like chorus, delay, reverb. Those tend to be the most common effects to get this thing done. But one very important point to make here is that the most important effects that you're going to be using are actually going to be those things. I'd say equalization, besides just standard leveling and frequency management through equalization, it's going to be actual just EQ. So all the other concepts of equalization and the various like manifestations that there are for that, things like delay and things like reverb. It doesn't really need to be, of course, you can use things like chorus, you can use rigs, you can use whatever you want, portal, whatever your persuasion is. The main point of this video is that less truly is more. I'm over here rambling, bro. What am I taught? What is blood babbling about? What am I trying to say here? But yeah, the whole point of that is that EQ, delay, reverb, really important things. Let's just get into a demonstration of what I mean by that though. Now this actually has reverb on the VST already. That's why it sounds so damn good. I'm gonna turn that down just a little bit actually. And I think pretty much the only thing I'm gonna add to this is some delay. And it's just the widened preset from Fruity Delay 2. It's amazing. Same thing, really just delay. Maybe a little bit more on that dynamic EQ. So taking this one step further, we can take this concept and mix it with the magic of signal flow, and we can create something that's called a send. And basically this is just a duplicate of the signal, whatever you're sending it to. And the signal flow guide down below is going to do a much better job of explaining this than I will in real time. But basically the point is it allows you to mix in a wet signal of something with a dry signal of it. So basically what I've got here is the melody bus right now, which is going to be the dry signal. And then this send is going to be a wet signal, which is going to have my convolution effects, which we'll get into talking about in a moment. But if I had to say what the difference between a bus and a send is, it would be that a bus is for the purpose of doing composite effects. and a send is for the purpose of mixing in effects with a dry signal or with a already composite signal, if that makes sense. Again, check out the signal flow guide down below. It's amazing. It's really good stuff. It's a very slept on video, actually. So I'm just gonna open this convolver preset that I have. Again, centerfold drum kit if you want it, but it's just pretty basic convolution. That's the preset right there if you want to copy it. And so what that's allowing me to do is get a sort of convolution is basically like reverb. That's the simplest way that I could explain it. And it's just giving a nice kind of like convolved signal. Maybe a little bit more on the wet. That's just so nice. That's so nice. And I can do the same thing for my drums as well, actually. So if I wanted to give them more width, I could do some room reverb. Same concept we just used for the melody. Maybe turn that down. EQ out a little bit more of the low end. And you see how much more presence that just gives the drums. So remember, we only have 10 sounds in this entire beat. Our goal is to make it sound as powerful and to convey the most amount of emotion possible just using what we know about music production. This is definitely something that's felt more than it's heard. So one last thing that we can get into talking about is a little bit more of an advanced topic, I guess if you could call it that, but it's not really. And it's just that it's checking the balance of your mix using tonal balance. It's only advanced in terms of like the amount of money you have to pay in order to get it. It costs like $200 to get this, but it's very, very useful. The best way to explain what this does is to say that it takes your track and compares it to a database of other tracks it has within a certain vibe, and it checks just the overall balance of your mix. So things like frequency and spectral distribution, and then it dials it down into this very calm graph that you can use to basically adjust the final master and mix of your beat in order to get it to sound more industry quality. You can also create your own preset banks, but I tend to see the best results when I just use this bass heavy preset that they have. It's very similar. I tested it against like full Wonder Girl mixes, and to the best of what I was able to observe, it's very close to that, if not dead on, in terms of like the balance of her mix. So I just use that and I get really good results. And I've practiced using this so much to the point where I can kind of hear where everything needs to be, and I don't even really need this to show me, but I just wanted to go through the demonstration really quickly. Let's see how well I did actually. So we'll switch to view. Pretty solid, pretty solid.